I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a series of hot-button topics that are stirring controversy in the Jewish world and really in the world in general. There remains enormous attention being paid to the jihadist attacks in Paris, as more and more information indicates the extent of the terrorist web across Europe, which was able to beat European intelligence and successfully engage in mass murder. The President of the United States has come under serious attack by those who believe American policy has been ineffective or perhaps even non-existent in the fight against extreme Muslim fundamentalism, which is at war with the West, Western Europe, the United States, and with Israel. At the same time, the anti-Israel BDS movement to boycott Israeli goods, to economically divest from Israeli companies, and to impose economic sanctions upon Israel, the BDS movement continues to gain momentum, as most recently, the European Union has voted to label Israeli products made on the West Bank. To many, this is a form of boycott of Israeli goods, though the EU insists that letting people know where a product is produced is not the same as engaging in a boycott. And the U.S. State Department seems to agree. Spokesperson Edgar Vasquez says the U.S. does not see labeling as a boycott. Vasquez also points out the U.S. administration does not consider Israeli communities on the West Bank to be Israeli, saying the American administration does not consider settlements to be part of Israel. Israel, on the other hand, points out that the only place in the world where the EU is requiring labeling is Israel. Well, in the midst of these events, I'm most pleased to have at our JBS phones now a person we regularly turn to for insight and perspective. He's a viewer fan favorite on JBS, Malcolm Hoenlein, Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, it's always my pleasure, and thank you for giving me my middle of the night as I work entertainment.
I'm great. Malcolm, where have you just returned from?
I returned today from Israel, where I was for a brief 4-day visit, especially to address a seminar that is held every couple years or every year by the Air Force, and it's attended by the 500 top officers, pilots, generals, former chiefs of the Air Force, and the current Air Force chief is the host. And it's really a tremendously moving event, and when you look at the quality of the people in the Air Force and the attitude of family that they have, the level of intelligence, the interest, it's such a remarkable group. And they, of course, the elite of Israel, in a sense, as are many of the officers and Shemona Matayim and other elite units of the IDF. But it really renews your confidence, and you look at these often younger people, men and women, and you see their dedication and their true sense, true spirit of Israel embodied in them.
Yes. I've had the opportunity to visit an Israeli Air Force base and be addressed by someone who heads a squadron. And Malcolm, as human beings and as Jews, first of all, I just swell with pride, but these are truly remarkable men and women, yes?
Defending the Jewish state, but also the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the seminar was addressing what is the relationship between Israel, the diaspora, and especially from their perspective, and their vision of that, their sense of achrayut, and the reference to actually a picture that hangs in my office. As you recall, we talked about it, of Auschwitz with the 3 F-15s flying over the gate, and it had been in Prime Minister Olmert's office when he was Prime Minister. I was visiting him, and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, if you turn your back and the picture is missing, it won't be my fault. The next day, he delivered it to my hotel,
Wonderful.
And he wrote next to the planes, which are just above the famous entrance to Birkenau, where the railroad tracks came through. And he wrote, "Because of these, it will never happen again."
Yeah, that's a fabulous picture. And we have a film that we show often here on JBS called Eagles Over Auschwitz.
I've seen it, and and Amir Eshel, who is now the commander of the Air Force,
Yes.
was the leader of the in the lead plane of those three F-15s. And when he talks about it and the emotion and the incredible statement that he made, that people should go back and look at again, but it really is symbolized everything.
Absolutely.
All synopsized in that one picture.
Yeah, it gives me chills. Malcolm, what did you talk about when you spoke at this seminar?
Well, it's classified, so no.
But you always give us some
just
classified
between us,
information,
right?
Malcolm.
No, I talked about the secrets of the past as a guide to the future, and what I did is to try and talk about where our roots are, what is the importance of history, giving context, and why so much of what is happening today has come about because the world has forgotten. We remember because the world doesn't want to. We don't get lost in history. History for us is a guide to the future. And only through that context, do we have the clarity of vision that is so essential in such a complex and complicated time with globalization and an age of generally superficiality where people don't really understand the issues in depth because everything that's happening virtually is predictable, including the events in France. And you know that I spoke on the air about France coming under danger, that they know that there's going to be an attack and that they started bombing Raqqa and Syria because they were trying to preempt it because they had heard on the chatter and other things that things were in the works. And today they captured a second group that was planning major assaults. So it is imperative that we realize what our tradition offers us in terms of giving us a context and giving us the perspective. And when we see it come under assault by President Abbas now, who denies the existence of the temples, and by the way says also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is theirs, it's a denial of Christian tradition as much as it is of Jewish tradition. And he has this campaign which has turned the territorial dispute into a religious war, which is not containable, which can be incited, it crosses borders, as you know, it inflames in ways that these political disputes don't necessarily. And he has unleashed this with the constant harangue of the Al-Aqsa, the mosque on the Temple Mount is under siege, and that there's change of the status quo, which everybody knows is simply not true. And then he says now that not only did the temples not exist, but they've changed the name of the Western Wall to Al-Barak's Wall, saying it was part of Al-Aqsa Mosque, even though it was built, 800, 900 years before. Mm-hmm. And people should take this seriously because this is an attempt to take away our past, to take away our future. This is not a haphazard thing. This is a pattern we've seen emerging. And in my discussions with you in the past, I talked about the meeting of ISESCO, if you remember, in Jordan, when 42 countries came together and they wanted to change the name of the Kotel, the Western Wall, to Al-Barak's Wall, named for his horse.
Yes.
And I know that people, thought took it very lightly and about changing Rachel's tomb and calling it a mosque for Muhammad's driver, who never was there in his lifetime, and the Cave of the Patriarchs as a mosque. And then it went into various stages. And now UNESCO has dropped Kever Rachel, which for 3,000 years was the name, Rachel's tomb. No one ever disputed it until the 90s when they came up with this invention of saying it was a mosque for Muhammad's driver and eliminating the Jewish component of the Cave of the Patriarchs where the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their wives are all buried. And this attempt to strip us of our heritage, of our values, of the sources of Western civilization even, and an assault on the whole Judeo-Christian tradition and history. Mm-hmm. And it's not haphazard. It is there is a purpose behind it. Mm-hmm. And we have seen this throughout history that, they used to yell, Hep, Jerusalem et perdita, Jerusalem was lost. And the Romans did it, the Nazis did it, because it was the ultimate way to denigrate the Jews and say, you see, you have lost your connection to your core, to your center. And this conflict now is so difficult for a variety of reasons, mostly because it's whack-a-mole. You never know where it's going to come up again. But he has incited them on a religious basis, which can inflame the whole Middle East. You get that image out, and you see that 60% of Palestinians believe Israel is trying to destroy Al-Aqsa. When, if anything, the only destruction on the Temple Mount was done by the Palestinians, not by Israel.
Yeah. By the way, did you say that UNESCO has been willing to change the name of Rachel's tomb?
Yes. And now the new meeting that took place about a month ago, the latest meeting, the new documents of UNESCO will refer to it as the Mosque of whatever, and the Cave of the Patriarchs is a mosque. The Western Wall was supposed to be included in that. It was supposed to be called Al-Burak's Plaza, Al-Burak being Muhammad's horse. And in the last minute, it was deleted. So the Western Wall is still hyphenated as Western Wall / Al-Burak's Wall.
Okay, but I want you to make sure our audience understands. What's the significance of UNESCO changing the name? If somebody said to you, look, Malcolm, so let Muslims call it anything they want. We call it the Cave of Machpelah, the Cave of the Patriarchs. We call it Rachel's Tomb, Kever Rachel. Who cares what they call it? Why is it important for our viewers to understand? And we have many people who are not Jewish watching JBS all the time. You're talking to America here, Malcolm. What is the significance of UNESCO changing the name?
It's a very good question, because people tend to dismiss anything the UN does.
Yes.
We know they're biased. We know they're, and people denigrate its significance. And the fact is that it wasn't Jews who called it Rachel's Tomb alone. Every Islamic and Arabic document for 1,000 years and more called it Rachel's Tomb, Kutab Rachel. And they never denied the Jewish connection. I mean, it's in the Bible that Abraham bought the land for the cave to bury Sarah. We just read it recently in the Torah. And for then the next two generations also. And some believe Adam and Eve. So what is the significance? Who cares? They can whistle in the wind and say that Israel is on the moon. The answer is that it has a real-world implication. Mm-hmm. It means that you can challenge the right for Israel to do archaeological explorations. You can start bringing them to the International Criminal Court as a violation of a religious holy site of the Muslims, that Jews can't pray in these places, like on the Temple Mount, where Jews cannot pray. It's outrageous. But Israel has made this concession out of sensitivity or super sensitivity, even hypersensitivity, and many people argue with me. There's too many concessions have been made. Dayan should never have given over the keys to the Waqf in '67. We had a chance to do things, but Israel didn't take advantage of it. They have always been sensitive to the religious rights of every group, and they continue to be. And if you look at the only place in the Middle East where a Christian population has grown in the last 40 years is Israel,
right,
where it's thriving. No other country. It's being decimated, and you see the mass executions of Christians around the Middle East. I mean, tens of thousands of them have been killed, and little outcry. And here, as I said, the UNESCO focusing on this issue because, you have an automatic majority that will always vote for it, the Arab League, the Non-Aligned Movement, etc. So they passed this, and it passed, though, by a 26-5 vote, the United States being one of the 5 that opposed it, and 25 abstentions. So if all the abstentions would have voted the other way, would have been defeated. But they are too chicken. They're too scared, and they don't want to affront the Arabs. Why is it an affront to face a reality of history? Giving in is only a further invitation to extremist elements to exploit these situations. I can tell you many Arabs tell me that they're embarrassed by these moves, and they recognize the truth about these sites, and they don't feel denigrating is beneficial to them, which it isn't. But people should understand that this kind of UNESCO ruling can become the basis the next time when you go to the International Criminal Court, when the Palestinians and others will go and start raising objections to the fact that you have legitimate archaeological digs. They condemn things in this, like the building of the light railroad, like the excavations that are going on, even though UNESCO approved them. So and many other things that they specifically cite as violations of the status of these places.
Yes. It isn't as bad as the UN declaring Zionism is racism. But the reality is these things chip away at both Jewish legitimacy and the extent to which Israel is a legitimate expression of the Jewish people's right for their own national expression and a national homeland. And so I'm very glad you're here to say these are not trivial or purely symbolic or unimportant distinctions.
But you raise a very important point, and this is really insightful on your part, that this is linked to Zionism racism. Zionism racism gave the legitimacy till it was rescinded in 91, but then the damage was done. But from 1975 on, after it was adopted, it was the first break after the Holocaust when people could openly express anti-Semitism, but you did it in the form of anti-Zionism. But it denies the legitimacy of the Jewish state because it's not about 67.
Right.
Because it's about 47. It's about the right of Israel to exist. And these expressions all can find their links to that plot, and it was an organized plot involving the Russians, the Arabs, and others, to denigrate Israel, to deny Israel the standing of other countries, to deny the right of Jews alone in the world to self-expression, to self-determination, to a state of their own. And we find it being given expression in many ways, including the adoption of this kind of resolution or the EU labeling situation, which also singles out Israel of the 200 disputed territories in the world. And you made mention of it before, that the U.S. has said, well, it's not this, we don't recognize settlements as part of Israel. This is not about territory. This is not about those territorial issues that can be solved in negotiations, which the Palestinians refuse. It's much more fundamental. This is discrimination. It's bias at its core.
Okay, so Malcolm, take a moment now to address the specific issue that we started this in the news on. What's your reaction to the EU saying, we're not boycotting, we just want people in the European Union, all the European Union nations, people who live here, should have a right to know whether a product is made on the West Bank or not. That's all we're doing, the EU says. What's your reaction, and how do you want us to understand it?
It's disgraceful. It's a singling out of Israel among all the countries in the world, wherever there is a dispute, wherever there is an issue, and saying that it's purely technical is a lie.
Yes.
It's much more than technical.
Yes.
The truth is that the economic impact of the BDS right now is still minimal. But you know who it impacts the most? To show why this is such a hypocritical move, it punishes Palestinians.
Yes.
Because there are 30,000 Palestinians working in Israeli factories, 20,000 more in the West Bank and in the territories as a whole. Then you have 20,000 who do support work for them. There are 200,000 Palestinians working, living off of wages from Israeli sources. They're going to be punished. Israeli companies can move, like SodaStream. It moved, so it moved back into Israel. And who gets lost? It's all these the Arabs, the Israeli Arab Palestinians, who are working in these places. So it isn't out of concern for Palestinians. If you were concerned about Palestinians, deal with the corruption, with the money that the EU gives, the hundreds of millions of dollars to the PA that get taken, the kleptocracy that steals the money rather than investing it into people and using it to the benefit of Palestinians and building up the economy of the West Bank. So that's one. Two, this is the excuses that are being given for this. And I can tell you privately, a lot of EU officials tell me they're against it. This is terrible. We recognize that Germany has already said they won't implement it. It's going to be up to each country to make a decision. So now we'll see where the countries are, whether they actually move to force labeling. I know that in one of the Scandinavian countries, they had little yellow stickers put on products. I mean, what could be more offensive and insensitive? But more than that, they ended up putting it on Israeli products because they didn't know what the difference was.
Yes.
And then it ends up being put on kosher products because they saw Hebrew writing.
Yes.
All of this, though, is part of a broader picture, the BDS movement. It is anti-Semitic at its core, and people have to be prepared to say so. If you want to express a difference with Israel over a political decision, you have every right to do it. You have every right to make a decision. Boycotting apples and pears and things and saying, well, it's not a boycott, we're just labeling them. But they know that once you do that, this is the first step towards a boycott and a bigger boycott against Israel,
of course,
which so many of them have called for.
Of course. I think you say it perfectly. I hope everyone understands. By the way, there are people who've come up to me and say, well, American Jews should boycott European products. The problem is, there are no European products that we buy. But it really is it is a form of boycott. It's very, very troubling. I want to ask you a related question, and I want to preface it by telling the audience, you never say to me before you come on, what do you want to talk about? You never tell me what I can or cannot talk about. So I'm going to ask you a question which you may not have an opinion on, or you may not know enough, and you have a right to say to me, I just have to pass on this. But the Jerusalem Post, Malcolm, ran a story about a prominent American rabbi, Gordon Tucker, who leads Temple Israel of White Plains. We have many, many viewers in White Plains. Rabbi Tucker supports the New Israel Fund. In fact, he's a leader of its international council. And so a story ran in the Jerusalem Post. Ron Tarosian, an American Jewish activist on the right, has a PR firm of his own, and he, with a couple of others, has begun a rather vociferous and what some people call a hate-filled smear campaign of Rabbi Tucker and of the Temple Israel Board for supporting an organization, the New Israel Fund, which Tarosian claims supports the BDS movement. Now, many organizations on the American Jewish scene want to be part of the President's Conference. And we spoke earlier, not earlier today, but we spoke earlier when J Street applied for membership in the President's Conference. It was voted down, but there were some people in the Jewish community who thought the President's Conference made a mistake, that the big tent should include everyone possible in the Jewish community, even those who are on the far left, who are very critical of Israel. And there are some who argue if an organization does support BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction of Israel, which basically feeds the notion that there's something illegitimate about the state of Israel, that at that point the Jewish organization has gone too far, has crossed the line. I want you to tell me what you feel. Where do you personally place the New Israel Fund, Malcolm? And do you have any thoughts at all on this Tucker-Tarosian controversy?
Well, I mean, these are many issues, so I'll try and parse them out. But first and foremost, the biggest tent needs to have some standard, because then you have a tent that envelops the world. There has to be some criteria. And here, we have broadened the membership. Peace Now belongs, Americans for Peace Now.
Yes.
Amenu belongs to the conference.
Yes.
Both of them are their officers are part of the J Street board. So it isn't an exclusion of that segment. But when you have an institution like J Street, whose positions have consistently been against those of the conference, the community, against Israel, including on the Goldstone Report, including on Castleto, including on so many vital issues, they're entitled to difference. We have vast differences in the conference from far left to the far right. And we try to create a forum where they could be discussed. And we gave J Street every opportunity to sell it to the membership committee, which if you look at, you will see is not only balanced, but I would say even tilted left. And the people who were on there had really intensive discussions. They had 3 interviews with them. And each time they came back and they heard more, they lost more support because people saw what was behind it, what kind of attitudes and positions. And, they're entitled to their point of view. But it doesn't mean that we have to sanction it, that we have to say that everybody belongs. Should we let in Jews for Justice or in Palestine? Or I don't remember the exact name, but these groups that are picketing and demonstrating against Israel, and there can't be. So that issue was resolved by a democratic process, completely open and transparent, where people voted, and they lost by a 2-1 margin. It wasn't a close vote. Mm-hmm. And I think today their positions have consistently remained offensive to the vast majority of the people in the conference. The young people who are associated, I agree, we should find ways to include them and bring them back to J Street U, and many of them who are not tied into the attitudes or to the involvements of some of the leadership. So that's one issue. I don't know enough about the Gordon Tucker situation, but I understood it was from a discretionary fund, whatever. But people have a right to say when public funds are used, how are they used, to raise the question. But it's really a question internal to the synagogue, and that they have a right, and the members of the board, to say, if it's his own money, I mean, he's free to do with it what they want. It does tell you where he stands, and he has, I think, in the past made clear some of his positions. But people have a right to protest it also. And the New Israel Fund has associations with organizations that have engaged in activities that many people find, or some find truly offensive and hostile to Israel. And I think they have a right to make those views known. When people object to other organizations, you don't see the kind of rise to defense about it. And they should stand on the merits of what they do or don't do. And if they have a good, legitimate defense for some allocations of funds to some of these groups, and they may give money to a group that later engaged in activities they don't approve of, they should say so. And they should come out clearly. I have good friends who are involved there, and the people I respect. But I think that again, we can't just say everything goes. I believe that we're part of the National Task Force on Israeli Arabs. I believe that we have to improve the lot and the situation of Israeli Arabs. Not at any cost, not if there's security involved, but I'm talking about the fundamentals that 20% of the Israeli population can't be alienated, can't be ignored, and they are not. And in fact, if you look at the latest statistics, which those elements who criticize Israel will never mention, Israel, the number of PhD candidates, the percentage in Israel of PhD candidates has doubled. The number of BA candidates, it's now 14% of all the BA candidates are Israeli Arabs, including many women.
Yes.
And that's up from like 6% a few years ago under this right-wing government, as they condemn it, that has sought to invest and has done, and by the acknowledgement of all the people that they have really been involved, and their leaders from this government speak to the task force, involved with the task force, because they see this as a value also. So it's not, a blanket condemnation because people want to help Israeli Arabs especially, or even if they have some sympathy for something, if there's an injustice, those things can be addressed. But no country engages in more self-examination, gives itself, it holds itself to a higher standard than Israel does. And when they jeopardize soldiers, or recipients of aid from them jeopardize the right of soldiers that people can't travel, the accusations of war crimes, then people have a right to make their voices heard on these things. And I think there should be a public discussion and exploration of it. And I'm sure that there are things that we don't know that will come out that are positive. And then if there are negatives, those things also have to come out.
By the way, you should tell our audience, is the new Israel Fund part of the President's Conference?
No.
Has it ever asked to be part of the President's Conference?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't mean they won't apply. But
yes, of course.
They've raised questions about it, but no, they've never applied, and we haven't. By the way, I want to tell you something else that when from before, that people who feel, so what is the difference whether they about this discrimination and discriminatory practices? The Lawfare Project, which is is based here, but it's an independent organization that has been tracking BDS and defending Jewish students on campus facing discrimination, or pro-Israel students being silenced. And they have hundreds of lawyers around the country, by the way, half of them non-Jews, who work pro bono to defend it. One of their recent cases was against Kuwait Airlines, which refused to allow somebody with an Israeli passport to fly out of New York to London on their airline.
Yeah.
And they won. They won. That the Department of Justice adopted their brief, and the Port Authority has put a Kuwait Airlines on notice. They won't be able to fly out of New York anymore if they don't change the policy. So they have to make a decision. That's what we have to do. You have to highlight it. You have to go after them. We have to be consistent. And they have to know there's a price to pay if you're going to violate what we consider the standards of decency and propriety.
Malcolm Hoenlein, I said at the beginning, you are a fan favorite. Everybody wants to know, when is Malcolm going to be on JBS again? I am so grateful that whenever I call you, you make yourself available. You bring analysis and perspective that few have on the Jewish scene, and then you are the most articulate of all. So you know how much I love you, how much I love featuring you on JBS, and I will continue to chase you. And I'm sorry, you're getting over a cold. You've run here, you've run there. You come back from Israel, the first thing you do is talk to me. I am very, very grateful, Malcolm. You be well, and we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Be well. Malcolm Hoenlein, the Executive Vice President of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. My thanks to all those who make In the News possible: Sloan Copeland, Serge Goldberg, Dara Golub, and of course our producer, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.